Okay, so we are on Daf Ayin Ches 78b, and the conversation we're having is about two courtyards who have a fence or a wall between their courtyards, when and how they're allowed to join in an Eruv, and when they must make an Eruv alone. So they can make an Eruv independently if they have, because of the wall, so they can make in each courtyard its own Eruv. But if they want to be able to carry from one courtyard to the other, they can make a joint Eruv, but there has to be some connection. And so we saw in the previous Mishnah, if they have a window or a doorway. In this Mishnah, we saw if they have a method to get over that wall. And the Mishnah and the Gemara was talking about various structures that may be in one courtyard that would bring it up to cross over to the other side, as well as the usage of the top of that wall. If the space on top of the wall is less than 4 tefachim, so it doesn't have its own space. We saw two opinions of whether that nobody can use that or both of them can use it. We also saw if it is 4 tefachim at the top, so then they can both use that space up there, but they couldn't necessarily bring stuff down. And then we saw that if one of them was had easier access than the other, if one was within 10 tefachim of the top of the wall, while the other was less than 10 tefachim, more than 10 tefachim away from the top. In other words, that they were not, one property was higher than the other, and they had easier access to the top of the wall, they have rights to it. And so if the other side wanted to lift their access to the top of the wall, they can have a ladder there, they can have a pile of rocks, a mound of dirt, where they're within 10 tefachim from the top, and so then now they have equalized it. We also saw that if they built a platform, and so now the Gemara is going to tell us if that you can make multiple ledges getting to the top of that. So we're on the fourth line of 78a at the top. V'amar Rav Nachman amar Rabbi Barabu a Kollel tisha chayaser tzarach ziz echad atira. If the wall is 10 tefachim high, we saw yesterday, you can build this ledge with a ladder, and then you can step up and you'll be within 10 tefachim. That's true up until 19 tefachim. 19 tefachim, let's say 60 inches. But once you're at 20, so one ledge won't help, because that ledge is either going to be within the first 10 tefachim or within the second 10, and either way, it's not going to give you and remove all 10 tefachim. So but esrem, once it's 20, you're going to need 2 ledges in order to be able to make this wall permissible. So if it's 19, one ledge is going to be sufficient at 9.5 or close to 10 from the bottom, and that's going to be within 10 of the top, and you're going to be fine. But once you're once you're above 20 tefachim, 20 or above, so then you would need 2 ledges, one to minimize the first 10 tefachim, and one to diminish the second 10 tefachim. And the ledges would have to be not one on top of the other, because if they were, you wouldn't be able to have a ladder from the ground to the first ledge, and then from there to the second ledge. Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna had said, and this is something we saw earlier in the Gemara and in the Masechta Shabbos, that if there was a pillar in the public square, which the Gemara explained in Shabbos, this is talking about that it is on the sidewalk where people would hang their wares, so they'd have this 10 tefachim, at least 30-inch pillar for hanging wares, and the top is 4x4. So that's a classic private domain dimension, right? It's 10 tefachim high, so that classifies as its own space, and it's 4x4, so it's usable on its top. And so that would be a rishus hayachid a private domain within the public domain. And if somebody carries from the public domain and puts it on top of there, it would be prohibited. Now, this also has a peg, a nail, a screw, something at the top of it so that they can hang their wares on there. Now, that diminishes the usage of the top of the 4x4 because there's something in there, and you can't put a pot down on there that's 4x4 because there's something protruding in the middle. So Amud Bershus Arabit, Gavoya Asara, it is 10 tefachim high, V'rachav arba, and it's 4 tefachim wide, 4x4. V'na'atz b'yased, and he stuck a peg in it. Kol shehu, any amount, miato, that's going to diminish the size of the top of this courtyard. The top of this pillar, and not going to count. It's not going to count as 4x4 anymore. Amar Rabbi Barava. So Rabbi Barava qualified that and said, "Well, that's true. That peg would have to be 3 tefachim, let's say 9 inches above, because otherwise it's just like a bumpy top. But it's still going to count within the space of within that usable space at the top, and it's still going to count as a 4x4." So Abai and Rava both say they said no, even if it's less than 3 tefachim high. It's true that usually we say anything that's within 3 tefachim counts as solid, but over here it's not usable that way. So my time is, so what's the reason here we're going to say that it's not going to be it's not going to count as a proper space even though that it's within the 3 tefachim? Because you can't use the top. It doesn't make a difference whether or not it's halachically considered just a bump, but that bump makes it not usable, and you cannot use the top, so you don't have 4x4 usable on that platform on the top over there, and so there it's not going to count as a private domain. A private domain has to be 4x4 usable with it, above 10 tefachim on the ground. However, Ravashi afilu he goes to the other direction. He says it doesn't make a difference how tall it is. Even if it's more than 3 tefachim high, it's going to count as a valid usable space, and it's going to be a private domain. What's the reason? My timer. Because whatever you put on there on the top of the ledge, you can actually tie it to that peg. So the peg actually is functional, and that's why it's usually there. It's because people hang their wares on there. So you can actually not only use the ledge, but you have something to secure your package to the top of the ledge by tying it to that peg. So it actually is a functional top, and the peg sticking out is to assist the function of the top of that pillar, and it's going to count as a private domain. So Rava's son Ravacha says to Ravashi, Mila kula b'yeseidas mahu. Okay, so if you have one peg there, that's going to be valuable and usable because it's going to it actually is helpful to put a package down and tie it to it. What happens if you have multiple pegs sticking out at the top? So he said to him, well, I'm going to give you a scenario that shows that this is going to count as a valid private domain as well. Have you not learned the teaching of Rabbi Yochanan? We're going to go in Rashi's version of this teaching of Rabbi Yochanan, and it goes like this: if you have somebody dug a pit in a private domain, and as they dug the pit, they dug, let's say, 7 tefachim down. So let's call that 20 inches down. And by doing so, around the pit, they made a pile of the removed dirt that's an additional 3 tefachim high. Combined, you now have 10 tefachim depth from the top of the mound that encircles the opening of that pit down into the bottom of the pit. That's 10 tefachim. So that would be deep enough to be a private domain. Additionally, this pit itself is only, let's say, 3 tefachim by 3 tefachim. So it's not wide enough to be a private domain. That would be a makom patur, an exempt area, because it doesn't have the requisite 4x4. However, because the mound is outside of the pit, and now that widens the functional use of this pit as by an additional tefach. So now it's going to be a 4x4. And the explanation that he's going to say is on account of, because you can put a platform on top of that mound that encircles the pit, and you can and make that a 4x4 tefachim space, even though that on the outside it's only 3 tefachim from the ground, but it is deep 10 tefachim. So this platform is above a 10 tefachim deep hole, and it's 4x4, counting the mound that of removed dirt that's around the pit. And that would, since I can now put a platform on it and make it usable, it's going to count as a private domain, a reshus hayachid. Now Tosfos disagrees with this and says it would have to be that it's 10 tefachim on the outside, and the mound included. But we're gonna follow Rashi's opinion here in the explanation of the Gemara. So similarly, he's going to argue that is the scenario in this pillar that has pegs sticking out at the top. You can put a platform, you can put a piece of wood down on the top of it, or a pot down on the top of those pegs, and then you can put your wares on top of that platform. And so therefore, even though that the pegs alone are not as usable, just as the mound is not as usable, but you can put a piece of wood down, you can put a flat piece of wood and make it usable, so to the top of the pillar. So he quotes Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan said, the pit and its chulio, which is the clumps of clay, essentially the mound around the pit. Mitzdarf and Lasar, they combine to the 10. And what's missing in the Gemara here, but Rashi quotes from the Gemara there, in the original quote of Rabbi Yochanan, that, and it also combines to the width of 4 in order to define it as 4. Va'amai. And why does it define, why, even though the pit is less than 4 tefachim wide, the mound extends it? Why? Va'amai lemishtamish le, but you can't use it in the width of 4. So what are you going to say? The manach midi mishtamish, because he can put a platform on it, and then he can use the top. So to over here, he can use the platform, he used this pillar and the peg sticking out at the top by putting a platform on, and now he has a 4x4 usable space at the top. So we're back to ladders, and we're back to connecting between two courtyards. A wall that is 10 tefachim high will need a 14 tefach wall, a 14 tefach ladder in order to make it permissible. Rashi says this is on account of 4 tefachim, that it has to be at least 4 tefachim away from the wall, because otherwise it's hard to climb the wall on a vertical ladder. You need a ladder leaning. Tosfos points out that the hypotenuse of a 4x10 is only going to be just under 11. It's not going to be a 14. You're not going to need a 14 tefach ladder for a 10 tefach wall that's only going to be leaning a 4 tefachim away. So rather, Tosfos says that actually it has to be leaning as far away from the wall as it is standing upright on the wall. So if it's going to stand at 10 tefachim away from the wall, 10 tefachim high on the wall, it also has to be 10 tefachim away from the wall. And the hypotenuse of a 10 by 10 is 14.14. So that makes sense that over here it's a 14 tefach wall ladder, because the ladder is going to be leaning 10 tefachim away from the 10 tefachim high wall. It's going to be 10 tefachim away. And Tosfos says it would slip down, but it would have to be held up there. But the idea is it would have to be 10 away, and that's what he says. You have to have it functionally usable, that you can climb easily, And in order to do so, it would have to be on an angle and not straight up. And we'll see about that in a moment. Rav Yosef, however, Rav Yosef says, it doesn't have to be 14, because it could be 13 and a bit as well, because that would still give you one tefach from the top. So according to Rashi, that would still be that it's 4 tefachim away, and you haven't pulled it out any further. According to Tosfos, it'll be 13 and a half away, which would mean that the ladder will be lower than the top of the wall, but within a tefach. He says that the ladder can actually be 7, and it can actually be 7. Sorry, I skipped a line. Abaye says it can even be 11 and some. Now that way. It's only going to be missing 3 tefachim from the top, and it's less than 3 tefachim from the top. That counts as a connection, as we've seen multiple times. The concept of lavud, anything within 3 tefachim of the end space that you're looking for, it counts as within that space, and so too over here. Now the hypotenuse of 10 by 7 is going to be more than 11. So it's not really going to work out according to Tosfos. Tosfos recognizes that, and he says the ladder would fall flat on the ground if you have it leaning on 7 by 10. And Tosfos says that you're going to for a ladder like this, you're going to pull it to 7 tefachim in, because you're not. It always has to be as high up on the wall as that's how far away from the wall it has to be. So if you're leaning it at 7 tefachim above the ground, then you would have to move it away from the wall 7. And a ladder of 11 would suffice for the hypotenuse, or be even more, even too tall, but it'd suffice for a hypotenuse of 7 by 7. Even if the ladder is 7. And over here, of course, if you're still 10 tefachim away, it would fall down on the ground. So you're going to have to learn like Rashi over here that it is 4 tefachim away, and the ladder is 7 tefachim from the ground. And over here, it's pretty upright, and that's why it's going to be okay. Amar Rav Sulam Zakov Mamai Gemara. So Rav says that a ladder that is completely straight up does count, and it can remove it counts as if there's no wall over there, and you now have an opening to the other courtyard, even though that is not easy to climb such a ladder, but it counts, and that's going to be a valid ladder because you have access to the other side, and even though that it's just 7 and a bit, which means that it's within 3 tefachim of the top of the 10 tefach wall, and that's lavud. And so you don't need it to go all the way up. As long as you're within 3 tefachim, which we said is about 9-10 inches, that's going to be sufficient to be within the area of the top of the wall, and now that's sufficient to get over. Now, Rav said, I learned that, and I accepted from my teachers, that a vertical ladder that's not leaning also counts, but I'm not sure about the reasoning. Down in my time, and I don't know the reasoning. Amar Shmuel. So Shmuel, who disagrees with the concept and says it does have to be leaning, as he said earlier, Shmuel said that it has to be that the ladder is going to be 14. In other words, he requires that it's leaning significantly. Nevertheless, he's going to explain Rav's opinion and Rav's tradition that a vertical ladder that's not leaning also counts as a connection to the other side. Amar Shmuel Abba, which is Rav's name, and as they were colleagues, he called him that, or he called him that as my master, my father. So Abba doesn't know this reason. Just like with the itztaba al gabi itztaba. Yesterday, towards the end of the daf, we saw the concept of somebody built a platform, and they built it on top of another platform, essentially just as steps. They're not easy to step up on, but nevertheless, it's going to count as a connection. Amar Rabba, Amar Rabbi Chia, the Kollel Sheba Bavel. He says that a stump of a palm tree, Einam Tzrichin Keva, they don't have to be permanently placed there. My timer Kvedum Kavasam, because they're so heavy, that counts as a permanent fixture, and a placement there is going to count as a step into the next courtyard. And as long as from the top of that stump to the top of the wall is less than 10 tefachim, it's going to be a valid platform that counts as a connection to the next courtyard. My time, the weight, how heavy that item is, makes it a permanent fixture there. Rabbi Yosef Amar Rabbi Shaya, in the name of Rabbi Shaya, Sulama Shababavel. Similarly, the ladders in Bavel, they were also very heavy. They made them of solid wood, and therefore, they don't need to be permanently affixed there. My time because they're so heavy, they're always left there, and so that counts as a connection to the other side because it's a permanent fixture. The ones that say ladders, then for sure the palm stump. But the ones that say the palm stump, they would disagree and say a ladder is not sufficient. Rav Yosef asked Rabba, Sulam mikan v'sulam mikan v'kasha mi'emtza. Mahu. So we said that in order for it to be a minimal connection to the other side, you would need at least a 4 tefach wide, let's say 12 inches wide, connection to the other side. So that would be either your platform is 4 tefachim wide, or your tree stump is 4 tefachim wide, or your ladder is 4 tefachim wide. But you have these narrow ladders. They're sort of like stilts. They have place for 1 foot to step on. So they themselves are not. They're not wide enough. They're not 12 inches wide. Each one is, let's say, 3 inches wide, which would be, let's say, 1 tefach. Each one's a tefach, and now you have a gap of 2 tefachim between them that need to be filled. So you use a bundle of straw, which really you can't step on, but it does sort of lengthen and connect the 2 steps of each side ladder. Does that count or not? Amalein, a kaf regel oil. He says, no, that doesn't work, because typically a person would want to step at the center of a ladder. And over here, you can't do that because it can't hold his step. What about if it's the other way around? You have a narrow ladder, which is not 4 tefachim wide. Let's say it's a 2 or 3 tefach wide ladder. And so what you do is you add some straw outside of that ladder, extending the steps of the ladder so that it becomes 4 tefachim wide, which would give you the requisite amount of width of the connection to the next courtyard. Is that sufficient? And over here, the proper step is in the middle, so you can actually step in the middle and walk over. He says, yeah, that works because your foot can step on this ladder, and it is 4 tefachim wide, even though you can't step on the entire width of 4 tefachim, but you have a typical stepping space. Now we go to 78b, Ayin Chesamad base. Chakak lahashlim akosel. If your ladder is only 3 tefachim wide, let's say, or 2, and it's not the full 4 tefachim. And so what you did is you created an indentation in the wall. You removed some of the wall, and now you have, and now you have a place to put your foot, and you can rest your foot in these crevices in this hole in the wall, which is parallel and or essentially extending the ladder step in order to climb this wall. So you have, let's say, a 20 tefach wall. Okay, so 20 tefach is, let's say, 60 inches wall between the two courtyards. And you have a ladder that is a vertical along that wall, but it's only 2 or 3 tefach wide. And you want to extend that. So you extend it by creating these holes in the wall where essentially you can put your foot in. But it's not connected to the ladder. It actually is right near the ladder. How wide would you have to make that hole in the wall in order to, how tall would you have to make that hole in the wall in order for it to count? Amalei ba'asara. It would have to be 10 tefachim, 10 tefachim high, 4 tefachim wide, and Rashi's of the opinion from the bottom of the ground, regardless of how tall the wall is. Tosa says what it means is 10 tefachim up to 10 tefachim from the top of the wall. Okay, so now the Gemara says, what about if you made a chakakot kulot, that you don't have a ladder there? All you did is you created a ladder in the wall by making holes in the wall to climb. How much does that have to be? Amalei melekamaseh. Here it'd have to be that you made a 4 tefach wide, basically ladder the entire height of the wall in order to get over the entire thing. Umayshna. This is what's the distinction? Why by the ladder is it sufficient to have just 10 tefachim from the bottom according to Rashi, or 10 tefachim from the top according to Tosfos, and over here you need to go all the way to the top. There, the reason by the ladder you have a way to go up. It's just not fully wide. So as long as the bottom is wide enough, so then the top being narrow is going to be sufficient. Whereas over here, you don't have a way up unless you have these indentations, these crevices in the wall that you're making to step on. So then it would have to go all the way up. Rav Yosef Mirabba. Rav Yosef asked Rabbah, "Asol Elon Sulam." He made a tree. It's the ladder. Essentially, what he did was he put a tree there, and that tree had branches that he can climb and get to the top of the wall. Does that count as a ladder or not? T'bayil Rebbe, T'bayil Rabbanan. So this can be an opinion according to Rebbe and the Rabbanan. What is this Rebbe and the Rabbanan? The question, as you remember earlier on in the Masechta, we learned about someone who wants to make an Eruv, wants to make he wants to have the ability to travel outside of the city. In order to do so, you're only allowed to travel 2,000 amma outside of the city, and he wants to go farther than there, so he puts a meal to define his Shabbos space at the end of the 2,000 amma outside of the city, and then he can go another 2,000 amma. So can he put it in a tree? Because you're not allowed to use a tree on Shabbos because you may come to break off a branch. So you can't put your meal in the tree. But since at the definition of your space is at the onset of Shabbos. The onset of Shabbos comes at sunset, which is really in an in-between space. It's not yet Shabbos completely. It's because it's a matter of doubt at what moment it becomes Shabbos. So that's a rabbinic time of prohibition, and it's a rabbinic prohibition. So I can actually remove the meal at that point. But on Shabbos, I won't be able to use it. So does that so there we say that it defines your Shabbos space, Rebbe says, because anything that is prohibited as a derabana, as a shvus, which was the term we have for a rabbinic prohibition for Shabbos, derabanan. Most derabanans of Shabbos are called a shvus. So then the halacha is going to be that I'm allowed to I'm allowed to define my Shabbos space that way, even though that once Shabbos proper comes in, I can no longer take that meal off of that tree. But at the onset of Shabbos, I could remove it of the tree, from the tree. So, and that's the moment that I have to define my Shabbos space, that the Eruv is going to define the space. So even though at the rest of Shabbos I can't use it, it does define my space for Shabbos. So too over here, if we're looking to get over to the other side, so we're trying to define the two spaces as a single entity space, and that they can make an Eruv together. When is that done? Prior to Shabbos. So at the onset of Shabbos, I can climb over to the other side because I'm allowed to climb the tree at the onset of Shabbos. Once Shabbos comes in proper, I cannot. But at that point, we've already defined the space. So according to Rebbe, that should work. But I can ask the question even according to the Rabbanan. And that's what we're going to say. To Boyle Rebbe. So this question is according to Rebbe, who says that over there the Eruv counts. But to Boyle Rabbanan, and it's even according to the Rabbanan, who says that over there the Eruv does not count. So the Gemara explains. To Boyle Rebbe, we can explain our question according to Rebbe Adkan Lekama, Rebbe Hassam, because Rebbe, perhaps only over there the Eruv is valid at the onset of Shabbos because I define my space outside of the city by putting the meal in a tree. Because anything that's a matter of rabbinic enactment at the onset of Shabbos, at the Bein HaShmoshes, in twilight, the Chachamim did not enact that prohibition. So Hanimili Bein HaShmoshes, that's for Bein HaShmoshes, Aval Kula Yoma, but for the entirety of the day, you wouldn't count it as a good connection, so as a good space. So to over here, when we need the connection, you need to be able to get through to the other alleyway, to the other courtyard. And you can't use this as a ladder on Shabbos, so it doesn't work for the entire day. Or perhaps the other way around. Even according to the Rabbanan that over there, say it doesn't define your space because the meal is in a tree that you can't get on Shabbos. Pischu, over here, it really is a good connection to the other side. I have an entrance to the other side with a ladder. It just happens to be it's like you have a doorway that has a wild beast sitting in it. That doesn't mean there's no doorway. It just means that you can't use it. So to over here, I have a ladder to the other side. That ladder is in place, so I can actually access the other courtyard, so we're connected. The fact that there is a lion sitting there, there's a prohibition that doesn't allow me to get through to the other side. That's not going to limit the fact that I have a connection to the other side, and so the two courtyards are allowed to join in an Eruv. Furthermore, what happens if this tree is a prohibited tree? It's an Asherah tree. And since it is an Asherah tree, it was worshipped as a deity, as Avodah Zarah. So I have to destroy it. I have to burn it. Perhaps it doesn't count as a usable entrance to the other side because I'm not allowed to use it. So la Asherah sulam mahu. If I turn my ladder, I turn the tree that is an Asherah tree into a ladder. Does that count or not? To Baila Rabbi Yehuda, to Baila Rabbanan, and I can ask this according to Rabbi Yehuda, and I can ask this according to the Rabbanan. This is a discussion we had earlier in regards to somebody who put his meal or his Eruv on a grave, and you're not supposed to benefit from a grave. It is disrespectful, and it is the space of the deceased, so you're not supposed to benefit from it. But I put my Eruv there, and we saw that Rabbi Yehuda says that counts as a valid Eruv, and the Chachamim say it does not count as a valid Eruv. So the Gemara says we can ask it according to either opinion. Rabbi Yehuda only said over there that it doesn't count as a valid Eruv on account of that it counts as a valid Eruv even though that it's on a grave, on a kever. Because I can acquire my space on a prohibited space. But it's only over there. The basa the kanale eruv lenichale the linter. Because once the eruv worked, I don't need to protect the food. I don't actually need that food for Shabbos. It's just I only need the meal there at the onset of Shabbos to define my space. But it can actually be removed, so I'm not utilizing the protection of that space for the rest of the day. So I'm not really benefiting from it. And even though that I'm benefiting from it for a moment, as we saw in the Gemara over there, the concept of mitzvahs lav lehenos nitnu, that a mitzvah is not given for a personal benefit. And the only reason we said over there that somebody's allowed to make an eruv to extend their Shabbos space beyond the 2,000 amma was for a mitzvah, to go to study, to visit their teacher, their the various dvar mitzvah. So that's not a personal benefit, and therefore the eruv is not giving me a personal benefit. But from one courtyard to the other, that's going to be a personal benefit, and a benefit from a prohibited tree that I need to maintain throughout Shabbos, and therefore it should not work. A dilma, or perhaps the reverse, afilo rabbanan. Even according to the rabbanan who said over there that you could not do it, here it's okay. Pischahu, because it is a good entryway. I have a tree which is acting as a ladder. I have a way to get over to the other side. The fact that I'm not allowed to use it, again, is like a wild beast sitting in the doorway. It's a lack of access, but does not mean that I can't actually do it. Amar Leis, he said to him, Ilan muter v'asher asura. So he said, good questions. The answer is a tree is valid. The ashera is not going to be valid because it doesn't have, you're not allowed to benefit from it. Maskef la Rav Chisda. So Rav Chisda challenged that. Adarabba, quite the reverse. Ilan she'is a Shabbos garim lang. By a tree, what's the basis of your inability to use the tree on Shabbos? A Shabbos prohibition, because you may break a branch off on Shabbos, which would count as harvesting. You're not allowed to do that on Shabbos. So the prohibition of using the tree is internal to Shabbos. Your need of connection to the other side is internal to Shabbos. So that's intrinsic to your Shabbos space. You can't use this tree. It should be intrinsic and invalidate the Shabbos definition of courtyards. So nitzer. So then, therefore, it should be invalid for Shabbos. Ashera she'isa davar acha garm le. But in the Ashera tree, as far as Shabbos goes, this is a valid usage to the other side. It's a separate external prohibition. The avodah zarah, the idolatry issue, that's external to Shabbos, and so therefore that should be of no consequence to our definition of the connection to the courtyard. So if you wanted to use a logic that, well, you've got an entryway to the other side, it's simply that there's a wild beast sitting in there and that doesn't allow you through, that's more likely to it's more logical to say that in regards to the Asherah tree, because that's an external issue, whereas in the tree itself, that's internal to Shabbos. I'm not allowed to use a tree on Shabbos. So in regards to Shabbos, I don't have a good connection to the other side. It manami, so indeed it was said in Ki Asa Ravin, when Ravin came, and Ravin was one of those students that came from the Academy of Eretz Yisrael to Bavel and back and forth and gave the teachings. Amar Rabbi Elazar, he said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, and some say that Rabbi Abahu said it, and he would come from the academies one to the other to teach. And he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Kol she'is a Shabbos garam loy aser. Like Rav Chisda's logic, that if there is a Shabbos prohibition that doesn't allow you to use the connection from one courtyard to the other, that invalidates it. Kol she'is a davar acher garam loy. But anything that has an external prohibition that isn't internal to the Shabbos space, to Shabbos itself, then it's not going to be a problem. Mutter, it's going to count. And in a couple of days, we're going to see another matter like this in regards to a crossbeam or a vertical post, in regards to something that you're not allowed to benefit from. Rav Nachman Yitzchak teaches it this way. Elon looked at the Rebbe V'Rabbanan. In regards to a tree, since it's an internal problem in regards to the tree and Shabbos, so it's going to be, according to Rebbe, it's going to be valid, because Rebbe says at the onset of Shabbos, when you have to define your space, you're allowed to climb that tree. So it's still going to be a good connection at the onset of Shabbos. And even though the rest of Shabbos, I don't have the tree, I can't use it, but nevertheless, it's going to be valid on account of that I have the right I have the at the onset of Shabbos, I define my space as joint with the next courtyard. So the fact that I can't climb the tree the rest of Shabbos is not going to change. However, the Rabbanan are going to say that no, since you can't use it for the rest of Shabbos, it's not going to be valid. Asherah looked at Rabbi Rabbanan. And for the Asherah tree, he will say it's the same. As we said before, that according to Rabbi Yehuda, it doesn't make a difference that I'm not allowed to benefit from it because it's not made for benefit. And according to the Rabbanan, it's going to count as a valid, it's not going to count as a valid Eruv because I'm not allowed to benefit from it. The next Mishnah was dealing with the last part of the Mishnah that said that if you have between the two courtyards, you have a ditch that is 10 tefachim deep, 4 tefachim wide, that's going to invalidate the connection between the two courtyards and they cannot make an Eruv together. What happens if I fill it? So if I fill it with something that's going to be removed, that doesn't count as a filler. If I fill it with something that will remain, that counts as a filler. And what happens if I want to make a bridge across? I put a platform, a plank down, and I walk across. That'll also be a connection if it is 4 tefachim wide. Chritz shebein beis chatzeros. I have this, between the two courtyards, there's a ditch that is 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide. That invalidates the Eruv. Well, what happens if I fill it? Ma'arvin shnaim, so at first I can only make an Eruv independently, each courtyard alone. But they can't join it together. And even if I filled it with straw or hay, it's not going to be valid because I'm going to remove that because it's animal feed. However, if I filled it with dirt or rocks, then it's going to count as a good connection because I've removed essentially the ditch. And then now it's as if it's all one courtyard, and I must join the Eruv combined, and I can't make an independent Eruv anymore. If I put a plank across this ditch that is 4 tefachim wide, so that's going to be valid, and it's a good enough connection between the two. Similarly, if we have a porch between two houses, and there's a gap on that porch, as long as I put a plank down 4 tefachim wide, that you can walk from one porch to the other, that's going to be valid. Ma'arvin shnayim, and then you can join in an Eruv. But if you want, you can still keep it as a separate Eruv because each one has its own space. If it's narrower than 4 tefachim wide, so then you don't have enough connection between one courtyard and the other. It's like you only have a 2 tefach doorway or window, which we said is invalid to make the connection, and each courtyard would have to make their own Eruv and cannot join. So the Gemara says, why doesn't the hay work? A hay sounds like a good filler to this post, to this ditch. But Tevin lechayitz, and a hay won't be a connection. Well, Anantanan, we learned met ben shabein shtei chatzeros. If you have bales of hay piled up as a wall between the two courtyards, gavay asar tefachim, as long as it's 10 tefachim high, ma'arvin shnaim, that's going to be a valid wall between the two. And they cannot join in an Eruv together. Of course, if you have bales of hay, it's going to be a valid mechitza. It's going to be a valid wall between the two courtyards. But to count as a filler in your ditch, if you're going to leave it there and essentially make it useless to yourself, that counts as a filler. If you don't intend to leave it there, so therefore it's not going to count as a filler,